Good evening, colleagues and friends. Welcome to this event tonight. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this country and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. We are on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. Well, it's an exciting day in Sydney. If you were just outside, you might have heard the flyover of the Royal Australian Air Force, and the King, the Air Marshal of our Air Force, and the Queen have been downtown with a lot of people excited. Some people probably not excited, but it's a great day in Sydney, and it's a great evening to be here at this fantastic event. So welcome to Sydney Ideas, the University of Sydney's flagship public talks program. My name is Ben Eggleton. I'm a Professor of Physics and Pro-Vice Chancellor of Research here at the University of Sydney. For those that don't understand the taxonomy of university executive titles, pro is, I believe, from the Latin, and it really literally means supporting the Vice Chancellor in research, and that is my domain. So I'm delighted to open tonight's event, Trust and Error, as well as join the conversation and Q&A afterwards. Tonight we're going to delve into the drivers of fake research and science, why it's concerning and how we can address it. Now, by we, it's not only those of us in academia, but there are broader impacts and responsibilities for society at large that you will hear about. To talk about this, we have a world-leading authority on science integrity with us. Dr. Elisabeth Bik, renowned for her work detecting errors in scientific papers, will share insights on research misconduct and paper mills, and I think you'll explain what is a paper mill, which is a fascinating aspect of our current publishing regime. Now, after her talk, Elisabeth will be joined by myself and colleagues, Professor Judy Kay, Professor Nick Enfield, in a conversation to draw out the wider implications for trust and integrity amid rapid developments in technology, AI, artificial intelligence, misinformation, and social media. Professor Jennifer Byrne will host this conversation, and there will be opportunity for you, our audience, to ask questions. But first, we'll hear from Dr. Elisabeth Bik. Elisabeth is a Dutch-American microbiologist, and I think I can hear the accent is still there, and you'll hear a bit of that accent, I think. She has worked in both academia and industry, and since 2019, she has been a science integrity volunteer and consultant, and she's well known in the research community around the world. She has been a science integrity volunteer and consultant since 2019, as I said, scanning biomedical literature for images or other data of concern, and I think that is your superpower, it's fair to say. Her work has resulted in over 1,200 retractions and another 1,000 corrections. For her work on exposing threats to research integrity, she received the 2021 John Maddox Prize. So please welcome Dr. Elisabeth Bik. Elisabeth, over to you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, I'm originally from the Netherlands, background in microbiology, and I moved about 23 years ago to the United States, and I live in San Francisco. I worked 15 years at Stanford, and at some point I found that somebody had plagiarized my work. You can see that on the left of the screen. You can see this little screenshot of a text where somebody had not only copied my text, marked with red, like 3 paragraphs of a paper I'd written, but also text written by somebody else. It was a Frankenstein monster of plagiarized text, copy and pasted and turned into a book chapter, which was online. And I was very angry because somebody had stolen my work. And I'm still doing this work driven by the anger that I felt on that day. Then I started looking for more plagiarism, and I found by accident another paper that had copied and pasted images, photos that had been reused to represent different experiments, sometimes in mirror image. And so, again, I was angry. And I realized what made me angry is that for me, science is about finding the truth. It's about recording what we think is happening and being part of that great brick wall of science. Onto every scientist layers another layer of bricks. We do not science by ourselves. We work on the shoulders of giants. We do science based on centuries of science done before us. So every science publication will be the basis for new scientists forming their hypotheses, building on that, and so on. So if there's an error, or if there's even fraud in science papers, it could lead for other people to fail their research, to fail to reproduce that research. It could lead to a lot of wasted time and effort. And I feel it's my duty as a scientist to report on when I see an error or other problems in a paper. But science is, it's traditionally based on trust, but science is not immune to fraud. And of course, all of us are human, and as scientists, we just can make errors. So sometimes we could see that in a science paper. There's a bunch of problems you can think of that you could see in science papers, and I've listed many here. You might think of many more. I'm not going to go over all of these, but I'm sort of part of a team that reports on all these problems, and each of us has our own specialty. Some might find problems in animal ethics, in clinical trials that are missing a control group, in human ethics, all kinds of problems, statistics, but I focus on images. So if you think about scientific images, papers, or figures that you might find in a scientific paper, they could look like photos. They could also be tables or line graphs or other types of data, but photos have a lot to tell. There's a lot of details in photos, but sometimes you might see problems in photos like duplications. So I think I have some weird talent to spot duplications in images. I also would spot duplications in bathroom tiles and floor planks. It's not really a very useful talent to have, and I'm very bad in recognizing faces. But I thought maybe I can use my talent to spot patterns and use that to find problems like the ones you see here behind me. So starting from left to right, there's a simple duplication. There's a duplication in the middle that is repositioned, and on the right you can see a duplication with an alteration. So starting again on the left, category 1 duplication is where two panels are exactly the same, and I've drawn these colored boxes around them. They're not part of the original figure, that's just to help you see that these panels are identical, even though they represent different experiments. Now this could just be an honest error. A scientist takes a lot of photos, maybe is a little bit sloppy, doesn't label them well, or drag and drops the same photo twice. This could be an honest error. It's not necessarily misconduct. In the middle you can see 4 photos, 3 of them overlap with each other. That is a repositioning. And you can also think about mirroring, rotating, stretching photos. That's a little bit more likely to have been done intentionally. On the right, the photo that is marked with an altered duplication, here we're looking at photos that have duplicated elements. It would be like me taking a photo of this room and photoshopping somebody else's head on top of somebody else's body, and you see the same head, the same face twice. That doesn't happen by accident. That is not an oopsie. We made an error. This is done deliberately, and it could be misconduct. Now, I've done this work for a while. I'm slightly crazy, so I did a study of 20,000 papers, molecular biology papers, and I only looked at the images. I didn't read these papers, I just looked to the images to see if I could spot the duplications like I showed you previously. And I found in about 4%, 1 in 25 of those papers, I would find these duplications within a paper. These were all inappropriate duplication. So of course, sometimes a duplication is quite okay. Maybe the control is reused twice, things like that. But I specifically looked for inappropriate duplications. And I had 2 co-authors who had to agree with me. I scanned everything by eye. Nowadays I'm using software, but all of this was done by eye. So I found a set of around 800 papers with problems, and I reported all of these to the scientific journals in which they had been published. Unfortunately, not much happened after I reported them. 5 years later, only 1/3 of those 800 papers had been corrected or retracted. And I did send reminders. So this is a sad state of affair, because you might think that science is self-correcting, but after 5 years, only 1/3 has been corrected or retracted. So I was frustrated, and with me, many others who do this work. So we normally now post on pubpeer.com, which is a website where you can post the problems you found in a paper. And we also encourage other people to post and to read and install a plugin that will work with your browser, so you can see if papers have been commented on. So thinking about what is misconduct, why would somebody do misconduct even? I mean, I think all of us are probably thinking, I hope you're thinking, well, we're all honest, we would never do misconduct, we would never Photoshop or change our results. But unfortunately, that sometimes happens, and it's usually because people are in a sad situation. So I have 3 scenarios here which could lead to misconduct. The example on the left is that of a postdoc or perhaps a graduate student, a young early career scientist who ends up in a lab where that is run by a bully professor, a very demanding person, like where were you on Saturday type of person. That is not a lab I would recommend working for, but those labs definitely exist. And I've worked at Stanford, so I've seen these labs. So this bullying professor might actually say to this young person, like, why don't your results look like what I expected? I can ask another postdoc to do the results, and the early career scientists might feel that they might lose their job unless they give the results to the demanding professor. And if you're on a visa, that is actually quite threatening to lose your job. You need to return to your home country very quickly. So in a situation like that, you often see that people will perhaps Photoshop because they feel that's the only way out of that lab with a scientific paper. And so I'm a little bit, I can sort of see that people in that situation would cheat. But you can also ask yourself, who is then responsible? Is it the young person cheating, or is it the bullying professor? And I actually think that the senior person in the lab is most responsible for creating an atmosphere of integrity and trust and honesty. In the middle, I have a different scenario. That would be people who want to push a false narrative, like vaccines don't work, or vaccines cause autism, or cigarette smoking is good for you. These are all not true, but some people want to push out that narrative for various reasons, and they might cheat to reach that goal. On the right hand, I have what I call organized science fraud. And this is what we call scientific paper mills. These are scammer networks who will, they make money by selling fake papers or plagiarized papers or whatever to authors who need papers. And those authors might be early career scientists who are looking for a job in a different country where there's perhaps more science funding, and who really need a paper in order to either make a promotion or to become a postdoc in a different country. And they're in a dire situation. Maybe they don't have money to do science. But if they see these advertisements online, as you can see behind me, you can easily go on Facebook and see advertisements that are called call for authorship or similar wording. These are advertising fake papers that, and for, let's say, $500 or $1,000 or whatever amount of money, you can become an author on a particular paper, even though you've never contributed to them. So we see various forms of these scammers. There's no one paper mill organization. There's hundreds of them probably, if not thousands. And you see these papers being published. In some cases, they're plagiarized. In some cases, text is being synonymized and then plagiarized in a more sophisticated way. In some cases, guest editors are being bribed to participate in that and to accept all these papers. There's many different ways that these scammers work. Too many to just put in my talk today. But it's estimated, last year or 2 years ago, it was estimated that 2% of all papers that are being published after peer review are by these scammers, are from paper mills. And I think that's a severe underestimate estimate. I think it's many more than 2% of papers that are being published, and probably even maybe 10% or 20% of papers that are being offered for peer review to scientific editors. So it's a growing problem. It dilutes science. And of course, artificial intelligence is something that can be misused by these scammers. So artificial intelligence, I'm very worried about that. And I mean, it can do fantastic things, and it's fantastic to play with it, but it can create a fake text. It can write a text. It can write a scientific paper in 30 seconds. And what's not to love there? But of course, it's not as good as a real scientist. It's still untrustworthy. It creates fake references or fake statements. But I'm mostly worried about the fact that generative AI can create fake photos, fake images, because we tend to believe photos, a photo where it didn't happen, and in this case, it can create photos that are very realistic. So on the bottom right of your screen, you see 2 rows of histology images, basically slices of tissues stained with some color to visualize the structure of the tissue. The top row are real photos. The bottom row is artificial intelligence sort of creating photos based on real photos. And I think we're at a stage where we no longer can distinguish fake photos from real. It's very scary. So why do people do misconduct? I already gave some scenarios. It's mainly because there's an imbalance between being caught. The chance of being caught is very low. The consequences are also very low. But the advantages of cheating are very big. Of course, they could lead to better experiments. If you Photoshop your experiments or you make some fake experiments, they will look better. If you have better experiments, you can publish in a better journal, higher impact factor. Your resume would look wonderful. And in the end, maybe you'll have success and respect, and you come on TV and you win awards and stuff like that. There's a big incentive to cheat in science, because in science we love metrics. We love to judge a person on how many papers they've published and what the impact factor was of those papers. The consequences are very low, so there's this imbalance between these two factors. And it's almost like that science has no policing body or organization. It's like traffic or construction. I have the Sydney Harbour Bridge here. Construction, sports without doping control, or traffic without a police. Like, we need some government body or like some policing type of organization to make sure that if people cheat, that there's some punishment. And I think Australia is severely lacking that, but other countries that do have some organizations, those organizations often don't have enough teeth to really punish these people. And I feel if you cheat in science, I do feel you should not be a scientist anymore. So my last slide, I'm sort of summarizing what drives me. For me, it's about that science should be about discovering the truth. Science misconduct goes against everything that science should be. The rewards are high, the consequences are low. That drives the whole situation. I've talked about paper mills, the mass production of fake papers by scammers. How are we going to solve it? I think as scientists we focus too much on metrics. We should focus a little bit more on quality. We should slow down science and reward any efforts done in making science more reproducible. It takes everybody in science to be involved in that. And I do want to end with the tremendous cost of science misconduct. I already mentioned how much effort might be wasted by science misconduct, people trying to replicate those results. On another level, there's a cost for people who criticize science, like myself, like we science sleuths or science detectives are harassed, are being sued. It's just not a very nice job. I've received many harassing emails and tweets. It's not fun. But then finally, the final level of misconduct, the effects of misconduct are for the fields of science itself, because it could discredit science. I don't want you to walk away thinking that all science is flawed. we need science to solve the big problems in the world, but we need to know which papers are good. And I hope to contribute to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisabeth. That was a wonderful talk. I must say, you know, I've seen you present before, but I've always wondered what people who haven't heard this story before are thinking now. I guess we'll have some opportunity to hear about that.
I hope we hear some questions from the audience.
Yeah,
so looking forward. Yeah.
I'd like to thank Ben very much for a very warm introduction. So I think you'll be pleased to know that we're going to be unpacking this very challenging and interesting topic with a range of speakers. So I'd like to welcome my colleagues to the floor. So we have Professor Nick Enfield, Professor Judy Kay, and also Ben to come back and join us as well. Just to introduce everybody formally, I've actually forgotten to introduce myself, which is something that I probably do fairly regularly. So my name's Jennifer Byrne. I have two roles. I'm Director of Biobanking in New South Wales Health, and so I actually work in the state health system here in New South Wales. And I'm also a Professor of Molecular Oncology here at the University of Sydney. So I'll just formally introduce my guests. So Professor Ben Eggleton is Professor of Physics and Pro-Vice Chancellor of Research, and I'm very glad that you described the different tiers, because I think it took me about 20 years of being a researcher to understand the difference between the Chancellor and the different people. But yes, Ben is very important in research in the university, and I think we'll be looking forward to hearing your views from that kind of broad perspective. Nick Enfield, Professor Nick Enfield, he's Professor of Linguistics. He's also a member of the Fighting Truth Decay Research Node here at the University of Sydney at the Charles Perkins Centre, which I'm also a member of. And we also have Professor Judy Kay, so she's Professor of Computer Science, and she leads the Human-Centred Technology Research Cluster in the Faculty of Engineering at the University of Sydney. So you have quite a broad range of expertise here. And I think, Elisabeth, you've really shown, I know that your research has looked quite a lot at molecular biology, the kinds of papers that show the sorts of images that have been affected by duplication. But of course, this issue isn't restricted just to biomedicine. It's something that can affect all areas of science. And I think it's great to have this sort of broad panel here so that we can sort of talk about that a little bit. Nick, I might sort of start with yourself, because I know that, you've thought a lot about, as somebody who's an expert in linguistics, you think a lot about, how we receive information, how we sort of communicate our view of the world through that. I guess, can you sort of give us your reflections on what Elisabeth's presented, and particularly around, I think one of the things that she said was, we expect errors in science. I think we all understand that, but how do we get better at actually moving beyond the situation we are so that we can eliminate them and build something that's worthwhile? I think that block of bricks image made me think of your work.
Thanks. It was a really fascinating talk, and incredible to see the images and what's happening in this very recent years with the kind of power of technology. I guess what I keep coming back to, and I've thought about in relation to the kind of so-called post-truth problem that's a bit more general than this one, is that there's a real culture problem. So, you pointed to things like punishment and regulation and this kind of thing, and I think these are part of a solution. But I guess, and perhaps we'll talk more about what those things might look like. For me, I keep coming back to the culture of science as essentially an ancient kind of practice, really. So we were talking before about the example of Eratosthenes, the famous ancient Greek, the librarian of Alexandria. This is not my area, but the story is that he was receiving information from others in this area, and he was told that on one day of the year, the sun would shine directly to the bottom of the wells in this particular town, now called Aswan. And so it's a long story, and I'll cut it short, but he was able to infer from that, comparing the angle of the shadow from the obelisk in his own town, and knowing how far away these two places were from each other, he could ultimately calculate the circumference of the Earth for the first time, and it was surprisingly accurate. And it's a fascinating story because this person is a genius, but I think more importantly here, you can't get that kind of a breakthrough from just having a genius. You're relying on this information coming in. You've got people feeding back this information about other places in the world and other information. And there he is in a library, sifting through that information and thinking through it. And so, I think what's important there is that what generates science, and always has since those kind of earliest times of very systematic study, is pulling all of that information together. Now, obviously, this is presupposed by the stuff that we've just heard about, that we're getting, the publication system is our modern version of getting these anecdotes into the Library of Alexandria, and, it's clearly in this position of being polluted. And there's something very different about the motivations of the people who are feeding this information back, and in this case, if you are producing data with no interest in whether it's actually accurate or not, that's what philosophers technically define as bullshit, which means that you're making assertions where you really don't care if it's true or not true. So there's something deeply immoral about that, and that's what really strikes me when I look at this. So I guess the end of my reflections there would be to say that as Jenny said, error is expected. Error occurs, we get things wrong, and one way of thinking about what science is, it's a process of eliminating error. So that's what we're doing. But the idea that so much error is being injected into the system, it's an incredible self-own, and it's essentially just pollution. So it's a terrible problem, and we'd love to see solutions to it. And for me, what I'd want to add would be that has to be a cultural aspect of that solution, which is a real commitment to those kind of ancient principles of collective data gathering and error correction through that kind of community-oriented approach.
Yeah, and I think you sort of touch on the moral question, which I think, Elisabeth, when you describe how you found, the first time you found your work plagiarised, how you really felt quite outraged by that. Mm-hmm. I think it is a shock. It's not something that anybody expects, is it?
No, it's just a shock to see that, because you hear about plagiarism and then suddenly it hits home. It's like really very personal, and it still feels that way.
That's right. And I feel that, in a sense, science is, of course, it's an objective activity, but it really runs on trust. And that trust permeates through, that trust is essential for the peer review process. So I guess, Judy, I know you're a journal editor, as many people are, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about your experiences and how you've sort of had to navigate that, that desire to trust the authors who are submitting to you, but the need to also verify what they are presenting as being worthy of publication, from an integrity perspective.
Yeah, so I don't know that images are our big problem in the fields I work in, broadly human-computer interaction, and my journal's an International Journal of Artificial Intelligence in Education, flavour of the month nowadays, and the other one with the unfortunate name IMWUT, Interactive Mobile Wearable Ubiquitous Technology. It's a real winner. We should go into marketing. And we're deeply concerned about these issues. One of the promising things that is emerging is the notion of OSF and pre-registering studies, perhaps keeping your data and your code, and lots of things that would enable people to check what you've done. All sorts of things that you touched on, p-hacking, the person who feels pressure to produce results that show that whatever it was, my interface achieved whatever, throwing out results that are not convenient, so many ways to fabricate. I think the fact that you mentioned poor description of study design, these are all reasons that we reject an extraordinary percentage of papers in one of those venues. But one of the things we rely on is reviewers, a very precious resource, academics, carefully actually being very critical, having a very critical eye, and picking up things and saying, I'm sorry, I really don't understand this. But we know that that demands a lot of time, and maybe you can't be expected to recognise images. I think that's asking a lot of the average reviewer. But in my field, rerunning code, that is asking probably more than most people would be willing to do. Somehow we've got to find a balance. I think we've touched on the ethical issue. We have you do surveys of students and what they see is okay to copy. So it shouldn't be so surprising that we find some of that in the research world. Maybe you'd like to comment briefly on that issue of you were aghast, and I would love to think that everyone is aghast, but it's very clear they're not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it already starts at university, and I know that artificial intelligence, of course, allows a lot of people to make it very easy to write an essay. In the US, there's a lot of emphasis on writing essays, for example, and so a lot of AI is used to write those essays, and that is something I think we're not really ready for it. It's new technology, and similar in images, we saw that digital photography has enabled a lot of photoshopping. So it's often these new technologies that make it much easier to cheat, but it already has been easy to cheat, for a while. It's just perhaps easier to catch people. Like in images, you could just load different samples and say it's a different experiment than you actually ran, for example. So there's many ways of cheating, but with the ones that I'm catching with photos is really only the tip of the iceberg. Like you said, there's many different types of presenting data in other fields of science, and those might be much harder to catch fraud in. And so I'm just very worried that we are enabling a huge amount of students already to cheat, where it's harder and harder to catch. AI is going to make it much harder. At least I can catch a duplicated image. With generative AI, I feel there's just no way I can catch that. And we have to think about different technologies to catch people cheating. Or maybe we should leave that all out of the window, and maybe we should just focus on, can we reproduce science? Maybe that's going to be the new standard. Not, does the science look believable, because we cannot tell if it's real or not. But maybe we should just be able to replicate it, and that might be a completely novel way of publishing science.
What about the peer review part? A peer review is responsible?
Peer reviewers, to some extent, I feel, could catch some of the problems I found. But peer review is not really fraud detection. It's I think a peer reviewer will assume that the data is correct, is real, has happened as it was presented, and they might be looking for certain flaws, like, is there a correct control group? Can we indeed draw the conclusions the authors drew, whatever, from these data? But a peer reviewer will usually assume that the data is real. And I feel that real fraud detection, like the images I look at, or like statistical problems, that all, I feel, needs to be done by the publishers or the editors, because that is very specialistic. And as scientific papers get more disciplinary, it gets harder for one single peer reviewer to review all the parts of a paper.
So Ben, I know you're particularly interested in AI and where that's leading us. What are your thoughts, particularly from the perspective of, maybe from the perspective of physics? I've heard that, for example, physics, because at least in some fields of physics, you have these very large papers with many authors. Perhaps, do you think that builds in any kind of resistance to this kind of issue?
Oh, that's
large
a
team
big
science?
question. Look, it's a topic I'm very passionate about in general. For a number of reasons, I have been serving as an editor-in-chief of a journal for 15 years, and I'll speak to that in a moment. But I also, as Vice Chancellor, have courage of research integrity. So I live and breathe it at this institution, so I understand the integrity landscape here in Australia and at the institution. I guess I wanted to make 2 points. I'll come back to the AI, but I mean, speaking to physics, it's interesting because on the one hand, there's part of me that says, well, at least in physics, we have principles and equations and maths that guides us, and we work very hard to use those equations, and it's different to these life sciences. But then I'm reminded of my experience at Bell Labs, where I was for 7 years, and there was probably what could be described as the scientific fraud of the century. And you would know the story of Henrik Schön, who was a young scholar working on his own in a lab at Lucent Technologies at the time on what would be, what then was groundbreaking. He had 3 Nobel Prizes lined up, and he was publishing in Nature and Science and Physics Review letters, and this guy was just a machine. And then it turned out he was discovering new fields of physics, single molecule electronics, really setting up the 21st century in a way that we hadn't imagined. And it turned out it was all fraudulent science. It was just devastating for the field. Absolutely, it was incredibly damaging for scientific integrity. It took years and years and years, I think, to rebuild confidence. And I think the whole scientific publishing paradigm has changed, and you would be familiar with many of the changes now in publications. You have to put attributions to authors, and I think the editorial process and the peer review has improved. So I'm not sure physics is any different, therefore. I'd like to think it is, but it's not any different. I think, and I'm not sure that having 150 authors guarantees anything. I have no evidence, but I'm not sure. But what I would say is that AI is coming in at great pace. I mean, we've had Gen AI, it's taken off in the last 18 months. I'm a huge fan of it. I think it will transform and accelerate our business, our world. And so I talk about the good, the bad, the ugly of AI. But I was in a conversation last week that speaks to this particular issue because I'm an editor-in-chief, and we had our annual editor-in-chief meeting, which is usually in New York, and it was a meeting 6 a.m. to 2 a.m. every morning for a week. Editors-in-chief and publishers from all over the world, and the topic was AI in publishing. And so that editorial publishing ecosystem is grappling with how do we manage our business with AI. And so it speaks to the notion that authors are using AI to write their papers. So what are the guardrails there? We've got reviewers using AI to review the papers. That's fascinating. So we're already busy. It's pretty tempting to just take the abstract, the first page, and pump it into ChatGPT 4.0 and say, please draft me a relatively positive reviewer report
Relatively
for this
positive.
manuscript, and you'd be surprised how sophisticated the response is. And then there's the notion of AI accelerating the editorial process. So the editorial process can look for images, it can look for the quality of the manuscript. It's even the fascinating and pretty scary notion that the editorial process can be, the decision-making process can be influenced by AI. And I mean, it all begs the question, how do you train these AI algorithms to do that in a robust, ethical way? So we're kind of going around in circles, and you very quickly kind of end up in the Terminator because the AI is doing the research, writing the grants, submitting the papers, reviewing the papers, editorial process, and it's like, where is the human in the loop? So look, there's a lot happening. I actually think that in spite of what you've said, that on average, I think the scientific, what I see here in Australia at the University of Sydney, I think on average, it's not happening that often, but I'd love to unpack that, and I'd love to unpack exactly how often and what does it mean to say fake. But we have a pretty robust integrity framework here at the University of Sydney and in the country that I think is looking, proactively, and I think, as we've sort of echoed, at the same time, relentlessly committed to the culture change and the education and training that's required, particularly with our early career researchers and students. So I very openly talk about this Henrik Schön saga. His lab was next door to mine. I would see him walking the corridors of Bell Labs with the New Jersey Star-Ledger as they were filming this guy and putting him on the front page of the New York Times. I would have lunch with this guy, and I saw the damage that that did to science. So, so that is just a quick perspective.
And interestingly, I think his fraud was actually first detected through image analysis.
Yes.
I think
Yeah.
someone literally,
That's right.
a simpler version, someone literally looked at a figure, and I can tell
That's
you,
right.
I can tell you a bit of a backstory here. This is not widely known, but someone literally said, well, that noise over here looks pretty similar to the noise over there. Now, the backstory that's really fun, because I know colleagues up at Bell Labs, back in the day when Word documents that were being written would have embedded in them the actual data that was being used in the images and the figures. This is using the old package Origin. Remember Origin data packaging? So the data was sitting in the file. So they were actually retrospectively able to go back and look at these Word documents and stare at the data up to 9 significant figures and say, well, hang on, all this data over here to 9 significant figures is the same data that sits over here. That was back in 2001. And so it all crumbled and this guy disappeared and had his PhD taken off him.
Yeah, and there's a fantastic book written about
Yes.
it. Plastic Fantastic.
It is, it's a great
read.
It's a great
Yeah.
read.
Very
Plastic
good
Fantastic.
book.
My name doesn't get mentioned in it. Just
I've read it.
I'm
I've,
sorry.
I've read it and I didn't notice you in it, Ben. But
The
I
writer is Eugenie
Yeah.
Reich.
Eugenie
That's right.
Reich.
It's a great
Yeah, that's
read.
right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. If anyone wants to borrow it, see me afterwards. I can see that many of you have found the Slido link, and I can see some really good questions coming in. And some of these, I think, are speaking to sort of issues that we've just sort of started to raise. So I'm going to ask a question from Oliver, so they're saying clear structural factors give rise to a culture of fake science. What are some practical ways that the research ecosystem can overcome these issues, and what should we do instead? And I think this is very important because sometimes I feel it can be quite attractive to what's referred to as admire the problem, but we need to move beyond admiring the problem and thinking about some solutions. So maybe, Ben, I'll start with you. If you could think about some things that we either are doing now that are really important or that we could do, what are your thoughts?
We talk openly about it. We have
Yeah.
events like this that share stories with the community. We have across the university, across the ecosystem, a lot of engagement with our researchers. We have very robust research integrity officers embedded within our universities, and we have national platforms that are a champion of it. And I think fundamentally, it speaks to the values of the researchers working in the institutions and just ensuring that we nurture, recruit, mentor, develop the next generation. That's my initial framing.
Yeah, I would think about several approaches, like education of not just students, but also more senior people, about what is and what is not allowed, maybe with real life examples. Like there's some games developed and scenarios and apps that can help you with that, because very often these courses are very dry, and I think we need some real examples that dilemma is one of those games. Second, I think there need to be visible consequences for people who are being caught doing misconduct, like losing their jobs or not being eligible for a couple of years to apply for grants, maybe paying back grants. And then thirdly, I think we need to rethink the scientific publishing model, where we focus too much on metrics. Like I said, like how many papers did you publish, how many times were you cited, what's your H index. I think academia love those metrics, and maybe we should abandon them. And that's very easy to say because metrics are a very easy way to value a person's quality. But maybe we should think about like micro publications, where you publish just one figure, where other people can then replicate it. And replication is going to slow down science, but I feel science is going too fast. We're trying too much at the same time, and that is when people are starting to make mistakes and where they were trying to cheat. So I think micro publications might be a way to go. But I haven't thought that very much through. I hope other people can think about ideas.
I can speak to it. Look, there's a lot happening in publishing, and so an idea like that is worth putting forward, and I wouldn't be surprised if someone latches onto it. I think you're right. I mean, the other thing I would say is the culture where we do, as researchers, make mistakes. It happens, and most of the time when we make a mistake, it's a legitimate mistake. We've made a mistake. And I would like to see that we have a culture and a community where researchers then will actually acknowledge the mistake. And I'll give you one example where this happened recently, and the response was fascinating. And this was a Caltech Professor Nobel Prize winner. You would know this story, and she published, I think, in Science, as you do when you're at Caltech, and it turns out there was a bit of a backstory, but the results were not reproducible. And she went out and then withdrew that paper and was quite honest. And the response was totally, you had on the one hand, a bunch of very angry people saying, outrageous, take the Nobel Prize, just what you'd expect from a Caltech professor, just what you'd expect from someone who's won a Nobel Prize and not paying attention. And then you had the other half of the community saying, oh, what a relief, isn't that fabulous? Let's celebrate what she's done, because that's what we need to see more often, is honest researchers, and let's not punish her. I mean, it's embarrassing, and she's embarrassed, but let's not punish her, because that's the culture we want, that we make mistakes. Everyone is busy. These are big, complicated experiments. We can't sit forever on the manuscript. We have to publish. We have to get it out there, and I think the community expects us to get it out there at some point. So just to pick up on what you said.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. That it is that question of balance. We do need to, there is that optimum between quality and quantity, and where that lies is different perhaps for different fields. I mean, is that something that you think about, Nick? That balance of the need to communicate what we're doing with the caution to make sure that what we're communicating is right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would just echo what Elisabeth was saying about I'm not sure if you used that term, but incentive structures to me I think is really crucial, and that balance is hard to find if you were talking about things like very personalising a situation, like am I going to get kicked out of the country and lose my visa? Am I going to not get this job that I want to compete for? So there's these very strong incentives to get more publications, to get the ones in the better journals and so forth. I feel like culturally one way we could, I like your radical suggestion of just getting rid of certain things like H-indexes and rankings and things like that. It somehow seems unlikely, but it's a shame. It would be good to see serious consideration of it. But maybe one way to think about it is, what do we celebrate? So Ben was just saying, the celebration of somebody, speaking honestly. But the other thing is, you go to labs and you see, the big celebration is when you get that Nature paper, or when, these kinds of things. And it's maybe there are other things we could be celebrating that would turn us more towards the kind of the type of attitude we're after.
And looking at the questions that are coming through, a couple of people have asked about the use of AI, of course, to improve research integrity. Judy, you've been working in AI for a long time. What are your thoughts there?
Well, it's an arms race, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you're using AI on the one hand to generate it, and potentially AI to pick up what might be suspicious. I think we will continue, and I do think the fact we're recognising it means there are many small parts to the solution. There is no single thing that's going to get us past it. In my field, for example, we've started many times we want to do machine learning work and tackle problems where we need data. So we publish data papers with our code. Someone else reruns those, reuses the data, and then integrates it with other things. So we are really building on each other, but also ensuring we're checking in a way. Interestingly, your mention of retraction, some of the work we did was on looking at the fact that many people read their news on social media, and that news may include articles from popular press based on articles that have been retracted. And one of the problems is, I hesitate to ask this audience, but I think if we walked into the street and said how many people know what retraction means, there wouldn't be many. Do I dare? Put your right hand up if you think you know what retraction means. Left if you don't, and both hands if you're not sure.
Not like left and right.
That's good.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
you're certainly different. We've got a lot of right hands. This tells us a lot about this population. All right, put your right hand up if you think the average person in the street knows what retraction is, and left hand if you think they don't. Yeah, we've got a lot of left hands. So that's one barrier that even if you did tell someone this article's based on a retracted paper, if they don't understand what it means, we've got a problem. We could fix that, right? It's not impossible. The other thing, retraction. There are things like Retraction Watch that track the retractions. The publishers have got guidelines, the COPE guidelines, that are rules about what they're meant to do, not that they necessarily have it perfect yet. That would be one case where we could tackle fake news and let people know about it and track it down, because it's tractable. When we've got bad actors, who are purposely injecting dishonest stuff, it's a whole new ball game. I think actually one of the answers to your question is we need to take the various ways of being dishonest and look at each one separately and look at how to tackle it. I do think we're making progress. I know the publishers are worrying about it and producing tools, including AI tools, to help warn editors of papers that look suspicious.
We do have some time for questions from the audience. So if anybody does have a question, maybe pop your hand up. Oh, I can see a few people. And we've got some roving microphones. So I've got one over here, maybe another one at the front.
Hi. This is a question for whoever has an opinion. But obviously what you've said, Elisabeth, about getting papers published is a strong driver for fraud. So I'm interested in, often there's really important findings that might be counterfactual, that things are wrong or that things are different than people thought, and it feels to me like there's not as much interest in that, and I'm kind of wondering why. Do you think that it could be, that maybe we're looking at the wrong thing, that we should also be encouraging, findings that things didn't work or that people thought things were wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. I think science is heavily biased towards publishing positive results, and we're encouraging people to publish positive results. Many journals will not accept negative results. I'm just putting it very black and white. There's some journals that do. And I think that is a problem, because you might think you want to try something and maybe hundreds of other scientists have already tried that, but you would not know that it would fail because those papers have not been published. So not publishing negative results is a big big problem, because it leads to reproducibility, and so I feel that reproducing other science, even if that turns out to not be reproducible, is something that is very important and should be published. And so I feel there should be more journals. Maybe every university could have a journal of negative results, like the University of Sydney's Journal of Negative Results, where grad students are just maybe in the first year of their PhD are trying to replicate a study that might or not might be reproducible or not, but it should be publishable. So pre-registration in clinical trials is one of the steps that would lead where people promise to publish results even if they're negative. And I think pre-registration of preclinical biomedical research or any research would be a very good thing, where you just promise to publish the results even if they were negative. And I think that is what we need in science.
I think that's a great place, to wind up what's been a fantastic conversation. I'd really like to thank Elisabeth for joining us. It's been wonderful hearing your perspective. I'd like to thank the panel, all the people who submitted questions through Slido. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but thank you very much for attending. So there are, of course, other Sydney Ideas events that you can learn about. You can visit the website sydney.edu.au/Sydney Ideas. Thank you again for attending the Sydney Ideas event, and we look forward to seeing you at an event in the near future. Please join me in thanking the panel.